This is an audiobook of the text Religious and Moral Ideas in Babylonia and Assyria by Samuel A.B. Mercer, Ph.D., published in London in the year of 1919. And the book starts off with the preface, which I'm going to skip for brevity's sake, and then goes into a brief history of the timeline of the ancient Near East, which I'm also going to skip. It begins with Chapter 2, after the introduction, which is entitled The Idea of God in Babylonia and Assyria. The world has always been man's greatest problem. We not only love its landscape with all the power of our bodily senses, but we also store up its associations with us, its joys and delights, and we love it with all of our heart. Nor do we stop there, for we not only respond to that in the world which appeals to our reverence and gratefulness, and so love the world with all of our soul, or to that which appeals to our power of working, and so love it with all of our strength, but we also respond to that desire, common to all humanity, to solve the great problems which start out from the earth and from the sky to tempt us. Scenes in nature cry out to us to come and admire them, to come and work on them, or to come and study them. And immediately a series of questions arises to the baffled but determined mind. What hangs in the stars and their places, and swings them on their way? How does the earth build the stately tree out of a petty seed? How does the river feed the fields? What built the mountains and spread out the plains? These and many other similar questions, some simpler, some more profound, have always been asked by man. They leap out from nature, and pressing in past our senses and emotions and practical powers, never rest until they have found our intelligence. They appeal to the mind, and the mind responds to them, not coldly, as if it had nothing to do but just to find and register the answers, but enthusiastically, loving the nature out of which we spring. And so we love the world in which we live with all of our mind. This has always been the experience of man. In this respect, the early Babylonian and Assyrians were no exception. But the greatest of all problems that presented itself to early man, including the Babylonians, was the question of motion, what he intended and interpreted as a sign of life. What caused the rivers to flow and the leaves to grow, the wind to blow and storms to rage? Why did the sun, the moon, and the stars cross and recross the heavens? In short, what is that which seems to be the cause of all of the sounds and signs and motions which are continually in evidence? What else but life, the power of causing motion and noise? Man himself was free to move, to make sounds, to utter them, and in his power so consisted in his being alive. It was his life which was the all-pervading force of his actions. It was an easy step for the primitive man to make, when he transferred this same power, life, in every object to all objects, for every object was capable of manifesting power. Thus the early Babylonians endowed every object with a Z, or a life or a spirit. The world was full of spirits. These were river spirits, or stream spirits, rock spirits and mountain spirits, vegetation spirits and storm spirits, and many others. The ways of some spirits were understood more thoroughly than those of others, but none of them were understood completely. They were always more or less undefined, and so the various spirits were always more or less mysterious. Those spirits who were considered powerful and friendly were gods, and those who were unfriendly or less powerful were demons or indifferent spirits. The early Babylonians lived in small groups, families or small clans, separated from one another. Each such group recognized various gods, representing the different living objects in its neighborhood. But that one living object which impressed itself upon the attention of the group with most intensity became the manifesting medium of that spirit, which became the god of the group. Thus a social group, living in the neighborhood of a large body of water, would have a water god, just as the community at Eridu on the Persian Gulf worshipped Ea, a water god, but it would recognize the existence of many other gods. The number of possible gods was almost limitless. A nomadic group would develop a very large pantheon, and would change its gods even from time to time, its chief god being the specific god of the location where it was temporarily settled. In fact, such moving groups were apt to interpret its deity as a goddess, in keeping with the necessarily matriarchal character of its constitution. In moving groups, the mother is the permanent element in family life, a fact which often gives rise to a belief in a goddess as the head of a group of gods. This consideration will probably explain the power and influence of Ishtar among the early Semitic Babylonians, who were a nomadic people. It will also account for the fact that Ningirsu, or Lady of Girsu, god of Lagash, was originally a goddess. In settled and agricultural groups, a male deity was the center of divine life, with whom he was associated with a female consort. Thus, Ea's consort was Damkina, or the faithful spouse, and Enlil's was Ninlil, or Lady of the Storm. Primitive people ask of their gods that they be as familiar as possible, that they have to do with daily life, and that they seem to issue from the heart of common things and clothe those things with light which makes them radiant. They dreaded mystery. They hated to be bidden to lift up their eyes and look far away. They desired their gods to be near, and found them in all affairs of life, domestic and public, social and political. Consequently, when a group grew and became powerful, the god of the group likewise grew and became powerful. If the group added to itself other groups, or absorbed them, the god of the group added to himself the gods of the added groups, or absorbed them. In this way, groups of gods or pantheons arose. In Babylonia, the earliest centers of such enlarged groups, towns which added to themselves and absorbed all villages and towns in their vicinity, were Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Kutha, Opis, Kish, Agade, and Sippar. There were others, such as Lagash, Babylon, and Ashur. The god of such a center became the chief deity, and around him were assembled, among others, the gods and goddesses of the united and absorbed communities. Thus, at the dawn of history, we find Enlil of Nippur, Ea or Enki of Eridu, and Aun and Ishtar, or Nana of Erech, worshipped as heads of great groups of people. In fact, there is a reason to believe that each of these great centers held sway over a large portion of the country at different times. Enlil of Nippur, for instance, receiving homage from gods of distant centers, which were themselves centers of great groups of people. That is, the more powerful a great city or state became, the more extended the sway of its chief god was. This was also true of Ningirsu of Lagash, Nana and Anu of Uruk, Sin of Ur, and Shamash of Larsa, as well as Sippar. It sometimes happened, also, that the god of an absorbed town became the chief god of the absorbing city. This is true of Ningirsu of Lagash, who was originally lord or lady of Girsu, a town which undoubtedly became amalgamated into Lagash. Then, around Ningirsu of Lagash gathered a whole pantheon of deities. The chief of these was Bao. His consort, besides deities of irrigation, of weapons, of musical instruments, of household duties, and of cattle, and deities of surrounding towns were granted a place in the central temple, or a quarter in the city, of Lagash. Such were the goddesses Gadandug, Nina, and Inanna. In later times, Marduk of Babylon and his consort Sarpanit grouped around themselves such powerful deities as Ea and Damkina of Eridu, Nabu and Tashmit of Borsippa, Nergal and Alatu of Kutha, Shamash and Ai of Sippar, and Sin and Ningal of Ur. This was due to the extraordinary greatness of Marduk's city of Babylon. Nor did the tendency end there, for the characteristics and achievements of the absorbed and associated gods were very often assumed by the absorbing god. Thus, Marduk replaced Enlil in the creation story in the same way that he himself was absorbed by Yahweh in later times in the Hebrew references to creation. In the very earliest times, divine manifestations were seen in the commonest phenomenon, in streams, rivers, rocks and mountains, vegetation, and forces of nature. But according as men began to be more interested in the vast cosmic forces, so too their attention became centered in such phenomenon as the sky, the earth, and the ocean. The sky was perceived as Anu and personified as such. The Semitic word Anu is derived from the Sumerian word Ana, which means heaven. The deity Anu was supposed to be enthroned in the heavens, and as such was the highest of all gods and the king of gods. Why the center of worship of Anu was the city of Uruk is not known. It seems that the inhabitants of that city happened to be the first to give prominence to this sky god. In Assyrian times, the god had a home at Ashur. Anu's worship can be traced back to the very beginning of history in the Tigris-Euphrates River valleys. He was the supreme dispenser of all events, especially of those which related to the earth, and his consort was Anatu, who was sometimes regarded as an earth goddess. Enlil, or Elil, was the lord of lands and the very personification of the earth. At a very early time he gained great eminence in Babylonia, for such great gods as Sin of Ur and Ningirsu of Lagash were called his sons. He is thought to have been the chief god of the Sumerian peoples, and as Nippur may have been the first settlement of the Sumerians in southern Babylonia, an explanation of Nippur as the seat of this god would thus be explained. He is sometimes called the Great Mountain, an epithet which would point to his origin among the Sumerians before they migrated west from their original mountain home. This would account for the name of his temple in Nippur, which was Ikur, or mountain house, a sanctuary built probably on an artificial mound to represent the original home of the god. Enlil has been called the older Bel. His consort was Ninlil, called also Belit Matate, or Belit Ile, or Lady of the Land or Lady of the God, respectively. Being a mountain god, he is also associated with storms, in the same way that the Hebrew god Yahweh was associated with Sinai and was known as a storm god. The deity which personified the great waters of the world was Ea, whose seat was at Eridu on the Persian Gulf, an appropriate place for a water deity. He is comparable with Osiris of Egypt. Being the water deity, and water being associated with exorcisms, Ea became at a very early date the chief deity of exorcism, and as father of Marduk, he retained that distinction until the latest times in Babylonia and Assyria. He was consequently the god of wisdom also, and as such the advisor and helper of mankind. His consort was Damkina, a shadowy counterpart who, like most Babylonian goddesses, never played any important role in any form of human or divine relationships. We end here on page 13, and we will pick up in part 2.